good evening and welcome to another edition of Resistance TV. In tonight's programme, we're going to examine the ongoing situation in Syria. NATO's been trying to destabilise Syria for more than a decade. The US has seized a third of the country where Syria's oil reserves and its wheat-producing breadbasket region are located. In November 2019, President Donald Trump admitted that the US is keeping troops in the country to steal Syria's oil. Back in 2018, Britain joined air raids against Syria based on false intelligence about an alleged chemical weapons attack on the city of Douma that never happened. I remember being interviewed on Channel 4 News at the time because I opposed the airstrikes. Kathy Newman was the presenter interviewing me, and she was gung-ho about the airstrikes. She sought to ridicule my scepticism about a chemical weapons attack and described Syria's President Assad as a murderous dictator. It was a classic example, in my opinion, of what Noam Chomsky described as manufacturing consent. But despite the best endeavours of Western imperialist powers, the people of Syria have demonstrated incredible resilience and remain loyal to President Bashar al-Assad. Now Syria is facing a new campaign concocted by British, French and US intelligence agencies to destabilise southern Syria. So I'm delighted to welcome Vanessa Beeley back onto the show this evening, who's joining us from Syria to discuss what's going on there. Vanessa is a courageous investigative and photojournalist, and she's reported on the ground from locations as far afield as Syria, Palestine and Yemen to eastern Russia and the Donbass region in Ukraine. Her work is highly regarded by people like the illustrious John Pilger, and in 2017 she was a finalist for the prestigious Martha Gellhorn Prize for Journalism. In 2018 she was named as one of the 238 most respected journalists in the UK by the British National Council for the Training of Journalists. And in 2019, Vanessa was among the recipients of the Serena Shim Award for uncompromising integrity in journalists. We could do with a few more like you, Vanessa. So it's an incredible privilege to have Vanessa on Resistance TV this evening. So hi, Vanessa. How are you, mate?
Oh, hi, Chris. It's really nice to be back on with you. And thanks for having me on. There's a lot to unpack in Syria at the moment.
No, absolutely. I just want to know, before we get into this new campaign by the British, French and US intelligence agencies, I wonder whether you could tell us what the impact of sanctions is on the Syrian population. Because, you know, talking to a lot of people, they think even now that sanctions are a humane alternative to military action. But the truth is, from what I've seen, that, they represent collective punishment of the civilian population, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, especially the sanctions that have been levied against Syria since 2011, even before then, but let's say they increased exponentially from 2011 onwards, ending, of course, under the Trump administration with the Caesar Act, based again on a fraudulent report of torture carried out by the Syrian government that was proven, that the majority of the photographs used in that case were actually of tortured Syrian Arab Army soldiers whose bodies were discarded. And yet that report famously sort of brought to the US and has since been recycled multiple times to justify sanctions against Syria is in order to punish any country that comes to the assistance of Syria. So this is extraordinary. We have unilateral sanctions against the Syrian people. Sanctions, in my opinion, are never against those that they claim to be targeting, which are usually government or government institutions in target countries. They are almost invariably unilateral, as of course we saw in Iraq with the death of 500,000 children that Madeleine Albright considered was a price worth paying.
Yes.
And so, here in Syria, after almost 13 years of war and destabilization and occupation by the United States and their various terrorist and the Kurdish Contra proxies in the northeast, and al-Qaeda, which has been described by Ambassador Jeffries as a US asset in Syria, occupying the northwest, with Israel, of course, illegally occupying and having annexed the Golan territory. Yeah. And the US has control, of course, of the oil resources, the agricultural resources in the northeast, And it steals more than 80% of those resources, either directly taking it to their own military bases in Iraq, or it's used to provide revenue for ISIS or for the Kurdish Contras, both of which have been proven to be US-Israeli proxies in Syria. And so the sanctions... Sorry, go on.
No, go on. No, you go on. Sorry, I thought you'd finished there. Go on, Vanessa, keep going.
So the sanctions, effectively combined with the occupation, mean that we have very limited electricity. Many people around here, for example, in the suburbs of Damascus, receive less than 1 hour per day, even in the hottest, coldest weather. We don't have water because we don't have electricity to pump the water to the tanks on the roof. Food prices are going up exponentially. Salaries they have just increased, but for the first time since 2011. So they're not keeping up with the price of food and the rising inflation. You know, it's hell actually for people in Syria. And for me, this is what sanctions are designed to do. They're designed, as you said, to collectively punish a people that is resisting any neo-colonialist project, whether it's military intervention or economic intervention or interference, and to force the people into a state of lack of dignity, hopelessness, despair, depression, where they will turn against the target government.
Appalling. You anticipated my attempted interjection there, because I was going to ask you. No, it's fine. I was just going to ask you explicitly, how was it manifesting for people on the ground? But that was what you was going to go on to actually describe, what you just described. But I'm just wondering as well, Vanessa. I mean, has Russia's intervention assisted, eased the situation for the Syrian people at all, or in terms of quality of life, has it not made that much difference, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, without Russian intervention in September 2015, the country would have been overrun by ISIS, that was being empowered and armed and equipped and enabled by the United States and its allies, which of course include the UK. The UK is now funding the largest ISIS holding camp in the northeast. Many people don't realize that, but the British government is actually funding the expansion of the ISIS camps under the pretext of providing shelter for many British citizens that, of course, were... the British government will claim that they went of their own will, but we know recently, for example, Samantha Begum was smuggled with the full knowledge. He was trafficked, basically, as a 15-year-old to Syria, allegedly by Canadian intelligence agencies, but with the full knowledge of British intelligence agencies. So I would speculate that British intelligence agencies know full well that children are being trafficked to Syria. And of course, now the government washes their hands of them and condemns them to a life of torture and abuse of children in these holding camps, which, as I said, the UK is now expanding. It's funding the expansion of these camps.
Vanessa, are there any corporate media journalists who are probing this stuff that you are uncovering, that you're speaking about this evening? I've not seen it. I mean, where are they?
They're basically providing the narratives that maintain the aggression and the blockade and the siege of Syria. And that has been their role. You mentioned manufacturing consent. All of British media, including The Guardian, Channel 4, you also mentioned Kathy Newman. I remember her openly calling President Assad a gas-killing monster immediately after the alleged Duma attacks that have now been completely disproven by dissenting OPCW, Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, inspectors themselves. And yet none of these journalists who have maintained the lies, and by so doing have maintained the bloodshed in Syria and have maintained and enabled and facilitated the misery of the Syrian people, have been held to account. Not in Syria, not in Iraq, not in Libya. It's quite extraordinary. In my opinion, these journalists who have really maintained the justifications for the pressure that NATO member states are putting on Syria are criminals.
Well, Julian Assange described the journalists who basically facilitate war, tell the lies that actually, warm up public opinion, as he accused them of being war criminals, and I don't think he's far from the truth, is he, in that regard? But just in terms of the OPCW that you mentioned, I mean, there was a lot of effort, wasn't there, put into suppressing that report that proved that the chemical weapons attack was just a fantasy, was just a lie.
Well, I mean, I was actually in Damascus when this attack allegedly took place, and quite a funny story. I mean, funny, ironic story was that the day before, I had gone on a kind of a media trip to liberated areas of Eastern Ghouta. Of course, Douma was one of the last areas, if not the last area, to be liberated by the Arab Army, which of course is why it makes absolutely no sense that they would use chemical weapons so close to their own troops, so close to their own civilians, that they were on the point of liberating, right? But we actually visited, alongside CNN and ITV, I think, various chemical weapon manufacturing sites and ammunition sites, factories belonging to the terrorist groups that had occupied Eastern Ghouta. And when the story broke of this alleged chemical attack, of course, I was there. I immediately spoke to people that were on the scene. All of them said, no, there's nothing. There is nothing. Like, we're walking in the building that was supposedly attacked and we're not wearing any protective gear. There's nothing, right? So that was the story that I immediately got in the first few minutes of it breaking. Frederick Pleitgen, who was the CNN journalist who I'd been with the day before, and I'd had the kind of prescience to film the people he was interviewing, which he was very annoyed about. He basically put out a report saying, it must be the Syrian government, blah, blah, blah. So I challenged him on Twitter and I said, really? I said, you were with me yesterday. You visited all of the chemical weapon facilities of the terrorist groups. It couldn't possibly be one of them if chemicals have been used or have been dispersed, accidentally in the liberation process, etc. He blocked me immediately, complained about me to the Ministry of Information here in Damascus. So, that just gives you an indication of how these journalists are not there to uncover truth. I mean, Robert Fisk went a few days later and almost kind of reluctantly said, I really do think this is nonsense, and of course he got lambasted by the BBC and all the rest of them that were tasked with supporting the chemical weapon narratives, not only this one, but the previous ones also. And then, of course, based on a non-existent dossier, not even a dodgy dossier. I was also there when the UK, France, and US bombed Damascus on the basis of a claim that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons, despite the fact that, of course, with the intervention of Russia, they had destroyed their chemical weapon stocks in 2013. And in all honesty, in warfare, chemical weapons are really kind of irrelevant,
It's interesting because, I mean, I quoted Robert Fisk, his observations. I also quoted military, in this interview with Cathy Newman, quoted, esteemed, if I can put it like that, British military experts who were also very skeptical about it, former First Sea Lord and so on, and the guy who was in charge of the British Expeditionary Force in Iraq, they were all skeptical about it, and yet, in spite of that, she continued to ridicule my sort of reasoning for challenging the decision to to launch airstrikes without even a debate in the House of Commons. But let's just move on if we can then, Vanessa. And I wonder if you could just tell us about this new campaign then by Britain, France, and the US intelligence services to destabilize southern Syria.
Well, I think just to give some context on the military situation, if I can, as it currently is inside Syria, because Syria to a large extent has kind of been put on the back burner because the war to a large extent had stagnated with, Turkey embedding itself in northern territory with its various Muslim Brotherhood proxies. The northwest, of course, al-Qaeda or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as it's been rebranded, with Abu Muhammad al-Jolani as its leader, formerly ISIS, then al-Qaeda, and then he created HTS. And the West has attempted to kind of whitewash him and create within, the group itself and the governmental spin-off in Idlib as being legitimate opposition to the Syrian government. PBS interviewed Jolani, so did France 24 fairly recently in May 2023. So in the Northwest, you have, to a large degree, you've got always here wars within wars. So you've got HTS fighting against various other dominant groups that may have backing from different countries inside the Northwest. But HTS, which is the US asset in Idlib, are the dominant force. In the north, as I mentioned, you've got Turkey annexing Syrian territory with their proxy groups, Muslim Brotherhood extremists, that are kind of derivatives of the original Free Syrian Army. US has recreated military bases in central Syria, so from the north coming down towards Palmyra, or to Raqqa rather, they've reinstated one of their former military bases, and of course they're building up military presence in the northeast, coming in from Iraq into northeast Syria. Recently, there's been a major bombing campaign to destroy railway bridges, the last bridges actually in the northeast that the US hadn't already destroyed. And the Kurdish Contras are stealing the railway track and selling it as scrap in Turkey. That's all ongoing at the moment. There are clashes between various tribal factions and the Kurdish Contras. So, it's a maelstrom of confusion and infighting, really, because the various tribal factions that are now fighting the Kurdish factions are not actually necessarily with the Syrian government, but they don't like the Kurdish interference in their affairs also. So I always describe it as a kind of boiling pot of mafia interests, really. Take out the ideological religious interests and just look at it as a mafia operation. Then, of course, coming down towards the southeast on the border with Jordan and Iraq, you have the biggest illegal US military base of al-Tanif on that border with Jordan and Iraq. But what has been happening in the last couple of weeks, really, is that we've been made aware of a new, as you said, British, US, French intelligence campaign to stir sectarian violence in the south, particularly in the area called Sweda, which is home to the Druze community. Druze are an Abrahamic monotheistic ethnic religious sect, also existing in Lebanon and in Israel. And there's a very small minority that are effectively managed behind the scenes by Israel through Walid Jumblat, the leader of the so-called Men of Dignity movement, which is looking, again, just like the Kurdish factions, looking for autonomy, separating itself from central governance. And so we have the birth of a new federalist project, of course, in the south. But what else has been happening is the US has moved an estimated 7,500 terrorists down from the Turkish-occupied northern territories to al-Tanif. The plan is to deploy them to the Syrian-Jordanian border, which will close the border effectively to Syrians. They've been training up to 16,000 Druze militia in preparation for basically taking over all of the governmental security agencies, police force, etc. There's no real Syrian Arab army presence in this area. So if people start to hear, oh, the Syrian Arab army is cracking down on protests, it's nonsense, because the army is well away from this area, but it's always been very hands-off, because the Druze who have fought always, I mean, they fought against French colonialism back in the 1920s. They fought on the side of the Syrian Arab army against the imperialist project for the last 13 years. So people need to understand this is a tiny minority, but what makes it dangerous is the power multiplying by the US and its allies, including Israel, that of course sees an opportunity to seize further Syrian territory in the south, which will bring it closer to Damascus. Of course, it regularly, 2 days ago, carried out an attack on Aleppo International Airport, putting the runway out of action for 2 days. It's going to be back in operation tomorrow. So we're in a very precarious situation. And the only other thing that the US wants to do, of course, is to close the last remaining land border that connects Syria to Iraq and Iran, which is at Al-Bukamal, which allows humanitarian aid in, but it's also an area through which Iran does supply weapons and even oil to Syria to try and keep it going, because the US is stealing its resources. And regularly, the Biden administration has bombed this crossing. Israel bombed it even when it was bringing in humanitarian relief after the double earthquake tragedy in February.
Yes, and I think I remember we spoke about that when you came on the show last time to talk about the impact of the earthquake on Syria. I mean, we heard a lot about its impact in Turkey, but not anything, I don't think, on the corporate media about its effect in Syria, which was even worse. I mean, it's appalling, obviously, for the poor people in Turkey as well, but in Syria, I mean, the impact, even more devastating. But how did this information about this new ploy by these intelligence services come to light, Vanessa?
It came to light through various sort of media personalities here in Syria. And actually, they put out quite a lot of details, so they'd obviously been investigating it for some time. Obviously, I don't just take that information and regurgitate it. But when I started to look into exactly what was happening, everything was happening according to what they were saying had been planned by these intelligence agencies. And the interesting thing is that at the time that these intelligence agencies were allegedly meeting in Paris and money was exchanging hands, Qatar is claimed to be supporting this movement again. And we have to remember, Qatar didn't take part in the normalization with Syria and with President Assad. It kept very much in the background. And, it was the primary financier of the war against Syria from the very beginning. Saudi Arabia really pulled out around 2015. And when I started to look into it and put the pieces together, it started to make sense, right? Because in June 2023, there was an inaugural meeting in Paris of this new opposition, in inverted commas, umbrella group that is bringing together all of the opposition personalities and so on under one organization, which was established by none other than British Syrian oil baron Ayman Asfari, who of course funded the Tory government hundreds of thousands, particularly under Theresa May, and was investigated by the Serious Fraud Squad in the UK and in Italy, and it, has had a vested interest in regime change in Syria from the very beginning. He established the PR company Syria Campaign for the White Helmets. He promoted and supported the White Helmets both directly and indirectly. The White Helmets, of course, a CIA MI6 construct established in Turkey and Jordan in 2013, embedded exclusively with the armed groups, predominantly with al-Qaeda, to provide the chemical weapon narratives, the narratives that justify, in particular, UK intervention in Syria. And so all of these events that were going on around these claims being made by media here suddenly pulled everything together. So while, as I said, I'm not going to simply, say they said this, at the same time, when I put all the pieces together, what is happening is exactly what they predicted would happen. They're shutting down government institutions, they're blocking roads, they're forming so-called humanitarian corridors on the border with Jordan, which we think will probably be used to bring weapons and further militia into Syria. So everything is happening as planned. Now, the next step, which of course I do want to warn people about in case the stories start breaking, is that there is a claim that they will use snipers again to pick off civilians and then blame it on Syrian security agents, as they did in Ukraine, as they in 2014, as they did in Egypt. I mean, we've seen this multiple times, and they did in 2011 also.
Yeah, it's the same playbook, isn't it?
Yeah.
Has there been any reaction from the Brits, the French, or the Americans to these revelations about their latest campaign to undermine Syria? Or have they just
No, I was discussing this actually with a Syrian friend of mine here who does an awful lot of research that I rely on because he's always very accurate, and he was saying to me, like, what's going on? Why is no one really picking up on this? It's just bizarre. And I said, well, Ukraine is taking everyone's attention. Then you've got Africa. Then you've got BRICS. There's an awful lot, and I think almost deliberately the US is using this kind of opportunity when everyone is distracted in other directions to carry out this campaign. Biden's got another 14 months before elections. He's losing in Ukraine. He's losing face in Ukraine. I mean, he's losing face generally. So does he see Syria as a potentially an easy win, if not to achieve regime change? Effectively, if they end up annexing the southern territory, of course, Syria is effectively landlocked on 3/4 of its borders, right? Lebanon has been put into economic freefall. There are, I was talking to Marwa Osman about this the other day. There are hundreds of thousands of extremists that came in from Syria to Palestine, to Lebanon, and now living in the Palestinian camps. We've already seen clashes in the south near Sidon port between Fatah and Islamists in the camp there, which the name always escapes me. So, what they're trying to achieve, I think, is instability on every single border and border insecurity for Syria. So Syria, very much like Palestine, actually, that's what I keep seeing in my head, is this shrinking central territory that is getting, bites taken out of it with every single campaign. And this, for me, is almost more worrying because the Syrian people don't accept any kind of sectarian narrative now. They've lived through 12 years of Western narratives. They know what's going on, so they don't accept it. As miserable and as depressed as they are, as starving as many of them are, 90% below the poverty line, they are rising up and saying, like, forget it, you're our brothers. Why on earth are you doing this? And the government is trying to carry out negotiations with the majority of the Druze that support the Syrian state. This is the craziest thing, but the danger is how the US is going to play this. Not only the US, Israel, UK, France, etc. And there were three. Sorry, just quickly. There were three Republican Congress members that entered Syria illegally, of course, from the north on Sunday. Republican, not Democrat. To basically bolster their support for the opposition. So what is very clear, so they had meetings with the White Helmets, they had meetings with, obviously the border is controlled by the two terrorist groups that have just been sanctioned by the US, but clearly there's not going to be any penalty for them for meeting with a sanctioned terrorist group inside Syria illegally. So it's very clear that this is a bipartisan project to effectively, you know, weaken Syria to a point where it can barely survive, and then have control of it even without, toppling the government, basically.
No, indeed. I mean, of course, there's a long track record of this sort of thing. I mean, think of Afghanistan and so on. So it's the same sort of playbook repeated over and over again. I just want to perhaps just drawing things to a close, just a couple of other questions. Whether you might just say a quick word or two about. I mean, you've touched on a little bit about ISIS and the kind of links with the United States. So what if you could just maybe briefly say a little bit more about ISIS and the role of the US? Because I mean, again, that people would just be astonished, I think, by this sort of information.
Well, yeah, because the entire pretext for the US being inside Syria is to fight ISIS. But I mean, the reality is that ISIS was flourishing and gaining territory when the US and the UK were allegedly fighting it, until Russia came in September 2015, and then with the increased air power, ISIS started to lose territory until, of course, it was pushed into, I mean, predominantly into the northeast, but there are still terrorist cells even quite close to Damascus. We've had recent 2 or 3 major terrorist attacks against civilians in the southern areas of Damascus. And since the earthquake, ISIS has been carrying out attacks against Syrian Arab Army positions and civilians, and kidnapping civilians. In 2016, I think it was September, John Kerry at a closed session at the UN actually admitted on audio tape that under the Obama administration, they had allowed ISIS, I mean, I'm paraphrasing what he said, they had allowed ISIS to flourish because they thought it would be good to leverage the Syrian government. So it was, and then you have the stories of the weapons that were under the train and equip program that was supposed to go to the alleged moderates, 500 moderate so-called rebels in Syria. And funnily enough, they ended up in the hands of ISIS. If you go to 2016, and actually talking of Kathy Newman, if you go to 2016, I don't know if you remember this story, but the Syrian Arab Army was trying to liberate Deir ez-Zor from ISIS. And they were on Thada mountain and they were gaining ground, the Syrian Arab Army. The US, the UK, Denmark of all countries, and Australia, I think from memory, bombed the Syrian Arab Army positions by mistake. But even after they bombed them, they strafed them with machine guns and allowed ISIS to retake the strategic territory on the mountain. There are multiple stories like this. And I remember Kathy Newman interviewing Dr. Buthena Shaban, who's the political and media advisor to the president. And it was honestly one of the most shameful interviews I've ever seen. It was, there was no respect for what her own country had just done, committed a war crime, basically, on behalf of ISIS, against Syrian Arab Army that are the Syrian people. They're all conscripts. Every single family in this country has lost a father, a brother, sister, in this war fighting against Britain and the United States and EU and Israel, Turkey. And this is the thing, many people are not aware of the crimes that have been carried out by ISIS with the protection of the US.
Yeah, that's shocking. I mean, you mentioned Israel there as well. I wonder whether you might just sort of elaborate a little bit about Israel's role. I mean, obviously we know about the Golan Heights and so on and so forth, but just say a bit more about what they're up to as well.
Well, I mean, Israel, one of the reasons that this war started was because really Syria is the heart of the resistance, the pro-Palestinian resistance axis, right?
Yeah.
Even alongside Iran, Syria has been providing weapons to the resistance inside Gaza and inside the occupied territories for a very long time. Many people are not aware of that. There are Palestinian brigades fighting in the Syrian Arab Army. the Liwa al-Quds Brigade, which liberated the majority of eastern Aleppo because that was their district. Again, you know, the Palestinian movement, unfortunately, was weaponized against Syria from the very beginning. And that was very much the Muslim Brotherhood connection to the factions that were being used again and again. Throughout history, the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria has been instrumentalized to try and overthrow various, I would say, pro-Russia and pro-Iran governments that don't comply with US policy and Israeli policy in the region. But Israel had an active part in providing medical treatment for the various extremist armed groups, providing weapons. And of course, every time there was a gain by the Syrian Arab Army or there was a major campaign to liberate areas from terrorist occupation, what did Israel do? It bombed Syria. So it became very clear that there was correlation between the Syrian army campaigns, the terrorist retreats, and Israel bombing of what it perceived to be Syrian military air bases, air defense, etc. And now, of course, Israel is intent on destroying all of the weapon development centers inside Syria, because there was a recent report put out by a Tel Aviv university think tank talking in great depth about, in Hebrew, about the strategic threat of Syria. Now that the war has basically come to an end, it will turn to Israel. So the timing of this southern campaign is also very interesting, because it comes literally 2 weeks after this report was released, where Israel was basically talking about its strategy to prevent Syria becoming a real danger to Israel itself again. So, you know, Israel has been instrumental in this. They've mentioned, various officials have mentioned that they would rather see ISIS in power than President Assad. And they've been absolutely instrumental in supporting the extremist Islamist groups inside Syria.
Yeah, unbelievably shocking information. And just finally, Vanessa, I wonder whether you might say a word or two. You've touched in passing on the role of the white helmets. And of course, they're venerated by the media here and a lot of senior politicians as some sort of heroic group. But I mean, the reality is rather different, isn't it? But just say a word or two about them in conclusion, if you don't mind.
Well, the white helmets were brought in, as I mentioned, in 2013, in my opinion, as the Western media campaign was starting to fall apart. People were starting to see holes in the narratives and starting to realize that this was something more than it was being presented as in the West by the media. And so the white helmets were brought in to be embedded with the armed groups, to provide humanitarian imagery to the armed groups, to sort of whitewash their image. And of course, we've seen multiple rebranding of the various armed groups also to distance them from the crimes of the previous branding, etc. From the very beginning, the white helmets were filmed involved in torture, in detention, executions, cleaning up after executions. They invariably had their headquarters in the same facilities as Nusra Front, al-Qaeda in Syria, or even ISIS. And of course, they were tasked with providing, there was a British government draft document from, I think, April 2017, which said very clearly that the white helmets job was to provide corroboration for UK foreign policy. Now, just think that one through, what that actually means. It should be the other way around. UK foreign policy should be based on the evidence, right, received from an on-the-ground organization. But it totally inverts that by saying, no, the white helmets are there basically to corroborate our foreign policy, which is regime change, right? So very clearly to me, that suggested that they are there to produce the narratives that facilitate British government policy in Syria. And of course, they were instrumental in providing the chemical weapon narratives, which were definitely disproven in Duma to have been staged by the White Helmets. Yes. Even the BBC producer, Riem Dalati, put out a series of tweets saying that the White Helmets had faked the scenes at the medical point in Duma. But not only that, they stand accused by Syrian civilians of organ trafficking, of child abduction, of theft, of murder, of running all sorts of illegal trafficking rings, etc. And of course, none of this will ever get investigated. I remember having a conversation with a senior official at the UN in 2017, and they said to me, you know, this will never go anywhere. No one's going to do anything in the UN because the White Helmets are too politicized, and everyone has skin in the game where they're concerned. They are basically underpinning the Western war effort in Syria, so they're never going to go down. And of course, the only country that did expose them was Russia.
Yeah, no, indeed. And we all know what's happening with Russia at the moment. Listen, Vanessa, thank you very much indeed. I know you've got a very busy schedule, so we really do appreciate you taking the time out to speak to us on Resistance TV. You're addressing the UN, aren't you, later? So obviously you've got a lot on your plate, and you know, it's very, very much appreciated for you to speak to us. And hopefully, you know, we've gone some way to correcting some of the propaganda nonsense that is put out about Syria and giving people food for thought. So thank you very much indeed. Just finally, before you go though, Vanessa, how can people follow your work and keep in touch with the sort of information that you're putting out on social media and anywhere else? Where should they go?
Thank you, Chris. The best place is probably my Substack now, just Vanessa Beeley on Substack. They can follow me on Twitter. Telegram is where I'm probably also most active. I do still have, I'm not quite sure how, a YouTube channel.
Oh, great.
So, yeah, I don't know how. It keeps getting strikes, but it's still up there.
It's still up there. That's great. What's your Twitter handle, Vanessa?
It's just Vanessa Beeley. Everything's just my name.
Vanessa Beeley. So we just search your name and it will come up. Well, thanks again, Vanessa. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for watching this evening. We hope to be back next week, all being well. So until then, this is Kusum to say bye for now.